A spike in arrests downtown in areas where the homeless gather. Why San Diego police say the timing had nothing to do with the annual homeless count. Lives ended and some were changed forever. What we learned from San Diego's first school shooting 40 years ago this week. And where do drones fit in when it comes to law enforcement? A status check on the pilot program in Chula Vista. I'm Mark Sauer. The KPBS Roundtable starts now. Welcome to our discussion of the week's top stories. I'm Mark Sauer. And joining me at the KPBS Roundtable today, Scott Lewis, Editor-in-Chief of Voice of San Diego, reporter Abby Alford of KFMB TV, Gene Cubison, former reporter with NBC7 San Diego, and reporter Alex Riggins of the San Diego Union Tribune. Well, being homeless is not a crime in America, but those destitute and living on the streets can be picked up for pitching a tent or stashing belongings on public property. And a rash of such arrests downtown last week raised red flags among advocates for the homeless in San Diego. The timing was suspicious. And Scott, start with how many folks were arrested and where and were they, and why is the timing being questioned?
Well, they were in East Village. There was more than 60, I believe. And not necessarily just for encampments and such. There was a lot of drug dealing and other things they were picked up on. The timing was worrisome because that count is really important, and the integrity of the count is really important. It's how we get funding, but it's also a serious metric that we can use to determine whether things are getting better or not. And so the police say, and the city says, they were just responding to concerns in the area that encampments had grown up around East Village, and that there had been rains recently, and they didn't want to, do any actions while rain was coming. So they went in after that. I don't actually doubt that might be true. It's just that there were some homeless advocates and leader in particular of the regional task force on the homelessness who said in the future we should try to have a moratorium on that kind of action before this major count. And it's the constant tension, really, when you look at it, between the short-term solutions of cleaning the streets and stuff like that, and then the long-term, what are we going to do about this problem, which is sort of represented by that count.
And the count you're referring to, of course, is the annual homeless census. So they take a snapshot, a one-day point in time, right?
Right. Volunteers fan out throughout the region, try to get a sense. They try to talk to hundreds of homeless residents themselves. They wake them up and say, hey, why are you here? What's your circumstance? Can I get you some help? All these things. And then all that data goes in, and they can use that to make better decisions for, again, that long-term solution that we're trying to find. Okay,
and the advocates for the homeless, they were really caught off guard. They didn't see this coming before the count.
Well, there was not only some caught off guard, there was some making just straight accusations that the mayor and others were trying to, mess with the count. We didn't find any of that. We didn't assert any of that in that story, and that was the cause of a lot of defensiveness at the city. I think that there's a good chance that they got their signals crossed, or that they just didn't care necessarily that the count was coming. It was more important to react to some of the complaints going on. The fact is, there was an enforcement activity, about triple the number of arrests from the weeks before, and it may have disrupted the count, and that worried some people.
Right, and when you get folks who are arrested, and if they're in jail, they're not in the count, right? If they're
not necessarily. They are counted in a way. They're not part of the official count that goes to HUD, and it's more of an estimate. But it doesn't look like, it's not also just the total count. It's also where people are. We want to understand where they are. So if they get pushed off a street, well, that street did have people before that, and so it's a whole bunch of different things going on. The fact is that count is its importance has really increased.
Yeah, tell us about that a little bit. Where do the numbers go, and what's done with them, and what's the impact of that?
Well, the Housing and Urban Development Department, the feds, that's what they use to decide funding, and that's what's used to decide a bunch of other things on top of that, funding from other sources, and also just activities going on. And so, and again, it's a metric for us. Like, did homelessness get better? Did we make a dent? And I think, again, the police officers and the mayor's office really wanted us to know how bad things were in East Village, which is why they did this activity, which is another indication about how bad things still are. Right. If you want us to keep putting out, nothing has changed, nothing has gotten better in these areas, and we've had 2 years almost of complete urgency about this topic. So you want us to keep pointing that out, sure, but we aren't looking away from what's wrong. but the count is special and important.
Right, and reporter Lisa Halverstadt, we've had her on many times talking about this topic on this show, but she pointed out in her story and voice that the number of those actually arrested may be only part of the story because people scatter then. It kind of has a ripple effect.
Yeah, I mean, you think about triple the amount of arrests, that means there's triple the amount of the activity, which means there was probably triple the amount of disruption and all kinds of stuff. People, people are afraid that being homeless is not a crime, but there are all sorts of crimes that pile up when you're doing that, especially if there's drugs and alcohol involved. And the police officers, again, very proud that they got several dozen people that they say were dangerous or preying on the homeless off the streets. That's fine, again, but it's also an indication about how bad things are getting.
And you mentioned the response from the police, San Diego Police Captain Scott Wall responded on social media. For TV folks, we're going to put a little of that up, and I'll paraphrase this. Neighborhood Policing Division, created this past March, has 3 responsibilities: balance every single day, public safety, quality of life in the neighborhoods, assisting those experience homelessness with services and shelters. So, I mean, he's talking about, look, this was a legitimate thing. We're out there working with them. We're not just arresting them.
And I don't think the story did anything to point out that they did anything cruel, that they did anything wrong as far as what the police themselves did. Again, the question is, it came right before this count, and that count's important.
Right.
And so I think that, it was rather inappropriate for the city to put the police on the defensive about this. The police just carried out their orders. It was the city's leadership that made these decisions to do this kind of activity right before that count. And so I talked to the captain, and we had a great conversation. I don't think he did it. I don't have any problem with what they did necessarily responding to but the timing is something. It's not my fault. It was that awkward, and so I want them to deal with that.
Right. A couple minutes left in this segment. I did want to talk about the count itself. It hasn't changed a lot in recent years. The numbers I've got: 9,116 in 2017, 8,576 in 2018. So down a little bit, drop of 6% there. But how accurate is that count? I don't think anybody involved with it says, look, we found everybody.
No, they don't find everybody, but they do try to do projections. They try to use like multipliers. They find this many RVs, for example. They try to figure out how many more that might represent. But I think that was part of the problem last year. There was a lot of people concerned that they weren't counting some people in vehicles very well, stuff like that. Look, we can't make good decisions about what to do about the homelessness crisis unless we know what the crisis is and what the solution. So metrics are really important, and the city has had this really loose relationship with metrics. They're like, well, we're trying to get people off the street. We're trying to do stuff now. We're not going to sit here and wait for a plan. Well, it would be nice to have actual metrics that we're all agreeing are the most important metrics, where we're at now and where we're going to be, how many homes we have to build, all these things we have to do. And the more we push off those things, the more we'll be stuck sweeping the streets all the time and having these conversations. So that's kind of the point, is like, let's step back, let's get this right, and let's make sure that we do things that actually change the crisis.
All right. Well, we're gonna move on, but the figures should be out very soon, I think, from what we learned there that last week in January. All right. Well, we're going to move on. It was a time before lockdown drills and active shooter training. A normal Monday morning 40 years ago erupted in death and horror at an elementary school in the normally quiet San Carlos neighborhood. A 16-year-old girl who lived across the street opened fire with a rifle. And here's how KFMB TV reporter Jesse Macias described it then.
Minutes after 16-year-old Brenda Spencer started shooting, police officers arrived at the scene ready to take any necessary action in order to avoid any further bloodshed. After neighbors, nearby residents, and all the school children were safely evacuated, police mapped out their strategy. Prepared for either lengthy negotiations or for an assault, police took every precaution to keep onlookers away from the line of fire.
All right, and Gene, you covered this terrible event, and you were a print reporter then, even though you spent most of your career in television. Set the scene for us. Describe what you saw there that day in that neighborhood.
Well, it was chaos and shocking. That's a word. Maybe it's a cliche, but nobody had seen or heard something of that magnitude for the longest time. There had been individual school shootings, gangs, somebody bang, bang, one to the other, but 11 people, a principal and a custodian, and
shot dead. Yeah.
Right, and there were 2 newspapers on scene for that time. The Union had not gotten together with the Tribune at that time. The Tribune, being the afternoon paper, was the first in on scene, and they did some very good work in finding out who's there, what's happening, and so they used what was fairly normal in those days, and you used the word normal. It was not a normal Saturday, and got one of the reverse directories. If you got a reverse directory, it had every telephone number that they could find hooked to an address, so that you could find out, well, hey, who lives here, who lives there, and they began calling. I'm not going to say randomly, but methodically.
Zeroing in on where the shooter was in that house.
And they said, you live in that neighborhood, you're on this street. What's going on there? We understand that there's gunfire, kids are being shot. What do you see? What do you hear? What can you tell us about that? And a young woman, or a girl, teenage girl, said, yeah, that's me.
Right, had her on the phone.
And that's, that is the shock there. Hey, we've got the shooter.
Right.
And they began, interviewing her over the phone. Yeah, she was saying, I just don't like Mondays. They're a real downer. And they could not believe that they had the real story there. And they began putting that together, taking it down to get that on the next edition that they could possibly put out. And why are you doing this? I don't like Mondays. They're such a downer. And that later became, I think, as you have said, a song coming out of Ireland, where the Boomtown Rats, I don't like Mondays. I don't like lousy Mondays. And so what the police did finally, they knew where the shots were coming from. They were on scene, and they managed to drive, was it a garbage truck or some other large vehicle?
Yeah, I mean, I think your story said it was a garbage truck, right?
Yeah, in the line of fire, and began pulling kids out so that they at least had some comfort in knowing these kids aren't going to get shot. Others are behind this truck, and we've got to pull them out somehow to get medical help for them, which they did. But at that time, they already had gunned down the principal and the custodian.
Right, I want to give the names of that. Was Michael Sukar and Principal Burton Ragg, who were killed. And as you said, 8 children shot and 3 adults, including a police officer. Well, Abby, you interviewed this week Chris Stanley, who was in 3rd grade and at that school. And of course, the press reports immediately focus on those shot and in these situations here, but it just ripples through. Everybody's life is upended with any proximity to this terrible event.
Right, because even talking to him on Monday, it was through the school district. They have Ed Talks monthly, and they were talking about school shootings. So they had other school leaders and police there, and they brought in Chris Stanley, who's now a middle school teacher in Santee, and he had never talked about it since that day of the shooting. I said, you have never talked about this. He said, I did that day, and I never have since. And I said, do you tell your students? And he says, absolutely not. And to see a 48-year-old man, I mean, he still just continued tearing up for the full hour of this talk as we were interviewing him, to see the pain that he still goes through. And, you try to talk to him about it, and he says, that's just for me. I keep it to myself. And that's for me to deal with and for me to think about. I don't want to have to share this, but he says, he finally wanted to be able to share it because he knows that there's still so much that needs to be done to change. His big thing is that his class sizes, and I think a lot of us don't really think, we think about gun rights and taking guns away or doing these different things, but he just says, for him as a teacher, he wants to have smaller classroom sizes. He feels like he can build a better rapport with his students that way. And I thought that was an interesting fact because we haven't really looked into that. And he feels like if he has a better relationship with 20 students rather than 40 students or 60 students, that he can have keep a better eye on them and their health and access to health care too.
And Gene, you mentioned how it played out, where that Monday morning a police officer commandeered that garbage truck and blocked and saved so many folks and got help for those. How did it eventually play out? It went on for several hours, and she was on the phone, but the SWAT team showed up. Tell us how it played out that day.
Well, I was not the first on scene from the union. We had people on the scene already, and I got blocked by the truck. It was my mission to go up and down the street and to get reaction from the neighbors, find out what they were doing.
Who they might have known her, or what?
Might have known her, yeah. It's the word in the neighborhood was she was a troubled child. She was a troubled child. Her father was troubled. The marriage had broken up, and so I was.
There might have been later. They learned there might have been some sexual abuse involved and drugs in the home.
Correct.
And she was a student herself at Patrick Henry High School, which is nearby.
Yes, she was.
Right.
And we tried to interview him. It was not me that day, but someone later went to the house when he was home, and he just slammed the door on in their face. My thought was, is this going to be a one-off event? This didn't happen very often. I mean, we are getting this kind of thing more and more.
Unfortunately, it's become a kind of a regular thing.
In this world, yeah.
What happened to her, Scott?
To Brenda?
Yeah.
Eventually, she did surrender. She came out and put her guns down, and they took her in quietly, I suppose, yeah. But she has been, since in the, what is it, how many years now? Since
40 years.
40 years, exactly. She has been in lockup and with no chance of parole.
Yeah, they've had some hearings, and it's not going to happen.
I covered one. The first one, as a matter of fact, and by that time she was cutting herself.
Oh, yeah.
You could see that her hair was all snagged, and it was strange. And she didn't, as I recall, say anything. She just sat there, and I sat behind her, and she just slumped over. And the parole people just it was pretty quick saying, "You're done with." Yeah. And every 5 years, I believe, or that was the time then, that they said, "Okay, come back in 5 years. We'll see what she's doing."
Yeah,
she's been denied parole 4 times, and I think she has a parole hearing this year.
I did want to bring up, she had written after one of the recent parole hearings where she was denied, she wrote to a defense attorney, quote, "What I did was horrible, so I don't really complain about the amount of time I've done." Such a long time. So I wanted to mention in the event that you covered in the interview you did with that survivor of that shooting, there's a forum coming up, and you mentioned that in your story, to address gun violence in schools. Tell us about that.
Yeah, the Brady campaign had mentioned in this Ed Talks meeting that on February 15th, they were going to have a student town hall forum on gun violence in schools and the prevention. And it'll be at Canyon Crest Academy at 5:30, and there's going to be thousands of students from all across the country. So you have your San Diego students, and as well as Parkland survivors as well, because as we know, after the Parkland shooting had happened, many of them have been on a crusade to try to end gun violence in schools. And so they're going to be coming here as well. So I think it's going to be pretty amazing to see students talking about this.
And one of the survivors, on a year afterwards, I say it's the 10th anniversary, we came, 10th? No, is it longer than that? He had become a parole or probation officer in this city. And he recalled that very seriously and said, yeah, this is what I want to do. This is what I'm going to do. I was steered in that direction by having survived that and wanted to be a part of somebody who could stand in the way of that. And so he's done that too. I forget his name, but we had him on the air.
Yeah. Fascinating story, I'll tell you. And unfortunately, as we said, it's become all too regular. Well, we're going to move on to the next topic, but we do have, obviously, an election season coming up. The Parkland students have been very noticeable. Maybe this will become part of the debate as we enter into 2020 election season. Well, we are going to move on. As in the fog of war, police officers are often severely limited in what they can see and know as a crime is going down. That's where drones come in. The tiny camera-equipped craft are literally eyes in the sky, and police in Chula Vista are finding out what drones can and can't do. So, Alex, start with right there. How did the police in Chula Vista, how have they used drones successfully so far?
So the way that they use them is, they kind of have their regular use, which is basically business hours, Monday through Friday. They can fly within a mile radius of the Chula Vista Police Department.
Just a short distance then.
Yeah, they have to be in line of sight. So they respond to 911 calls. If they get a 911 call within a mile of the department, they'll fly it out there just to check out what's going on before officers arrive. That's kind of the standard way that they're using them. But they found some creative ways to use them as well. Late last year, there was a little fire out kind of on the east side of the town.
Brush fire.
Yeah, and so they got the drone up above it so they could see where it's spreading, how quickly, that sort of thing. When there was a homicide, there was a road rage incident where one driver stabbed another. And so before they had a drone, or drones, I should say, they would get a fire truck ladder and they'd get up above the scene and take pictures of it that way. With a drone, they could just pop that up there and get video and pictures. So I've kind of been finding creative ways, going back to what Scott was talking about, before the count last week.
The homeless count.
Yeah, the homeless count. they got up above an area where they have a homelessness problem, and they kind of checked it out a day or two before just to see what was going to be there when they went in. Was there going to be 10 people? Was there going to be 500 people? Whatever the case was. So they put their drones up above that just to get a lay of the land before they went in and actually did the counting. So they've found some creative ways to use them.
And this is a pilot program, so to speak?
It is, yeah. So last year there was 10 cities or agencies around the country that were chosen by the federal government to take part in this pilot program. City of San Diego is putting together their own proposal. Chula Vista was putting together a separate proposal for the police department. And when they found that out, they just combined them. And so, the City of San Diego plus the Chula Vista Police Department were chosen for this integration pilot program by the U.S. Transportation Department. And so there's 10 cities or agencies around the country that were chosen for this. They kind of got fast-tracked FAA approval to put the drones up in the sky. There's some really interesting things going on. They're going to, in the future, they're going to be testing, package delivery, medical delivery. So you go and get your blood drawn. Instead of waiting for a courier to take it, a few hours later, they can stick it in a drone, fly it straight to the lab where they test the blood. That sort of thing is going to be tested right here in San Diego. But kind of the first agency to get going was the Chula Vista Police Department because they didn't need as much testing before they go out and fly these things. They could kind of get right on it.
And your story noted they had a few glitches along the way, hasn't it?
They did,
smooth
yeah.
Sailing.
So they have 2 drones that are kind of their best ones. And just a few weeks into the program, there was a firmware issue. So it wasn't an issue on their side. It was the company that makes the drones, DJI, which is based in China.
Mechanical failure.
Yeah. Basically, they couldn't tell the battery life. So it could have 10% left, and it would tell them they had 30% left. So just fall out of the sky out of nowhere. That didn't happen in Chula Vista, but they were afraid that it might. And so they had to ground those 2 best drones, which have 30 times zoom cameras.
A lot more capability.
Yeah,
right?
just very, very strong, powerful cameras. So they had to use, less powerful drones for about 2 months, actually, until earlier this month.
So I wanted to raise the issue about if there's a civil liberties issue here. Obviously, if a police officer, if they want to go in your backyard, they want to go in your home or observe what's going on, generally have to get a warrant unless it's a hot pursuit. But here, we've got a drone flying over your property, looking down on you. Have you heard complaints from civil libertarians? Or
so there's been no specific examples yet of a drone flying over a house and peering into it or anything like that. But there's certainly ACLUs raising concerns about what drones could do in the future. They've put out statements. I didn't touch on that on my last story, but on a previous story, I had talked to someone from their organization, and they're certainly worried about privacy issues. They're worried about drones surveying protests and things like that, where
capturing video and recording.
and recording who's there and who's protesting
who's
what.
doing what.
So it's like
Right, Scott?
we already have helicopters, right? And they fly around. But on the one hand, the drones would be better because they'd be quieter.
Yeah, you wouldn't even perhaps notice them.
Right. On the other
As opposed to a
hand,
helicopter.
you wouldn't notice them.
Right.
And then you would. That's the problem, right? You helicopter, you're aware they're up there. There's obviously something serious going on. But the drone could be sitting up above your house, watching you do everything, and you'd never know.
Sure, and with those powerful cameras, they could be a half mile away. You'd never see it, never hear it. And with that powerful camera, they could see right in, So there are certainly privacy concerns.
Well, and it comes down, so you've got a couple of pilots somewhere in a remote area who are flying these things
Right,
and looking at the cameras. It comes down to kind of their decision on what we're shooting, what we're recording, right?
Exactly. The way that Chula Vista does it, they have a pilot that's in a control room inside the police department, and then they have another kind of co-pilot that's on the roof that can see it all the time. But yeah, that's the exact concern is they can be remote controlling the drone and be peering into homes, looking on protests, whatever the case. So that's certainly a concern. Chula Vista right now is being really open, really transparent about the way that they're using them. Their kind of motto is that we're not being proactive, we're being reactive. So they only respond to 911 calls. They're not flying them around looking for crime or anything like that. But certainly in the future, that is the concern is that privacy could be very easily invaded with these.
All right, we're almost out of time. I did want to ask you, though, on the positive side of it, how effective has it been? There's been some arrests thanks to the drones and some effective policing, right?
Yeah, as of January 11th, and it started in late October, as of January 11th, they'd helped in making 14 arrests. Obviously, the drones aren't doing that, but they look at the scene, and the officers can actually pull up an app on their cell phone on their way to the scene, so they can see what's going on before they get there. So it's, it should improve officer safety is a big idea. And they've used them 231 times between that late October, mid-January. So there has been some success for sure.
Well, we'll look for some follow-ups and see what they say. It sounds like once you get the drones, you may not go back. We'll see what happens. Well, that does wrap up another week of stories at the KPBS Roundtable. I'd like to thank my guests, Scott Lewis of Voice of San Diego, Abby Alford of KFMB TV, Gene Coverson, formerly with NBC7 San Diego, and Alex Riggins of the San Diego Union Tribune. Reminder, all the stories we discussed today available on our website, kpbs.org. I'm Mark Sauer. Thanks for joining us today on the Roundtable.